And on that note, it's we're back. Not just us, of course. Roaring Kitty is back as well. I'm Izabella Kaminska, and this is the Blind Spot kind of podcast because we're going to explain what we're doing. We've evolved it a little bit, and today I'm not joined by Josh Unseth. I'm joined by Dario Garcia. You know what? I've never actually properly pronounced your name. Hello, Dario.
Hello. How are you, Izzy?
So quickly, I think we should just explain what we're doing. This is the legacy channel of my podcast with Josh Unseth. I've hijacked it. He doesn't know, actually. I will let him down gently. That's not to say we will never do another podcast with Josh. It's just life got in the way. I got very busy, started doing 2 jobs, and podcasts were one of the sacrifices I had to make. However, we're experimenting because the Blind Spot newsletter is still going. We put one out every weekend religiously, unless I'm on holiday, in which case Dario takes over. Right?
Yeah. All right.
No, he tries to. Although I'm almost never entirely on holiday. So we've done it quite religiously, but we feel like we need some, as they call it in the industry, they call it reach. We need some reach into the kind of free space. We thought a good thing to do would be to run through our newsletters, not in text, but through this podcast, because it might be a useful way for people to download. The idea is it's not going to be more than, we're going to aim for at 30-40 minutes. And Dario and I are just going to go through last week's podcast, last week's newsletter. So our subscribers will hopefully not get pissed off because they've got everything ahead of time. Also, this is a different medium and we will only scratch the surface of our analysis. And yeah, let's kick off because last week's newsletter, the running theme was the entire economy is an influence op. Yes, it was, which is a play on the title I gave to my series at Alphaville when I decided the entire economy was Fire Festival and that almost everything in the system was corrupt. So it's a derivative of that. But before we go into that, that was our big blind spot last week. But before we go into that, the other thing that happened, do you know, Dario, what happened last week? Do you remember?
Plenty of things happened last week.
But one of the biggest in the investing space must have been the death of Jim Simons, who, for those who do not know, was the man behind Renaissance Technologies, one of the best performing hedge funds in the world, specifically their Medallion Fund, mysteriously outperforming absolutely everybody. And there's so much to say about Jim and how secretive the whole thing was. I didn't have time to go into it in length, but we flagged it and we're going to come back to it. Do you know why, Dario?
Why?
Because there's more to Renaissance than meets the eye. And obviously, for those who don't know, Renaissance also employed one Robert Mercer. Do you know who Robert Mercer was?
Rings a bell. Rings a Brexit bell.
Robert Mercer is a big donor to the Republican cause, known for helping to seed SCL and Cambridge Analytica, amongst other things, but also donating heavily to the Trump cause in cahoots with Steve Bannon and all that lot. Jim Simons, on the other hand, was a big Democrat voter. And this kind of, the reason I flagged it is because it nicely fits into our everything is an influence op theme this week. And the other thing people maybe don't appreciate about Renaissance Technologies is how early they were to the large language model thing, because Robert Mercer and I think it was his fellow, it was Brown as well, wasn't it? Peter Brown, who were key kind of developers of large language models back in, I think it was at IBM. And it has always been suspected that they were utilized by Renaissance to help deliver those outsized returns. So everything you're seeing now is just like a public version of what Renaissance had. And you can go further down the speculation path. People like Eric Weinstein and myself have speculated that maybe, just maybe, this is completely theoretical. Renaissance has some links with the NSA through Jim Simons, who did officially work for them in the past. And he, I mean, theoretically speaking, if you had the world's most sort of privileged data set because you're the NSA and can hack into everybody, I mean, what would be the temptation to monetize it in the markets? What do you think?
For the greater good.
And for the greater good. And there's a question of whether it would be legal or not, because if it's the government doing it, theoretically, it could be legal. Central banks, after all, are allowed to do it. Not saying they're doing it. This is all theoretical, of course, but it's just something to ponder. But let's move on. Before we get to the big blind spot, let's leave that to the end. I feel like we should go to the next part of our list of, well, actually, no, the tyranny of the sticky note is part of the influence of Uber. Uber had results last week. Dario, you looked into it very briefly. What were your reflections?
So basically, this is something that came up on Wall Street Bets several times over the past 2 or 3 months, which is that Uber surprised green in their earnings at the last end of 2023 was actually the result of a huge bump in the valuations of several companies that they'd invested in, and that this year the valuations of these companies had completely dropped. And so it had been obvious, at least on these Zoomer forums for a long time, that Uber's valuation was going to suffer as a result of probably disappointing earnings. The really interesting thing with Uber is, do they even have any levers left to pull profitability? Because we've all noticed the service has just gone down a cliff since COVID, but especially in the last year. It seems even more expensive than taxis, even down here in Spain, where it was always quite cheap.
Well, none of this will come as a surprise to my readers. Actually, I don't know. I don't even know if Dario knows this, but so I've been looking and claiming, that Uber is somewhat of a smoke and mirrors operation for many years now. The profitability, they famously created their own marker of profitability. I think it's something like EBITDA, they created their own specific measure, but the issue really is whether they have added any real efficiency, and thus far it doesn't look like they have. We're very much close to Hubert Horan, who is a former aviation analyst who's been writing about Uber for many years, highlighting these sort of profitability issues for since the year dot. And he has always said to me that he can't understand why the press generally doesn't scrutinize the results properly. Why is the press not pushing back on some of these claims? The DD profitability earnings I think they came out last year in August with the first claim that this was like proper profitability. Hubert immediately debunked the whole thing. So we did cover that in the Blind Spot newsletter at the time. And he was right. And I did ask him, I got in touch in terms of what he was thinking. He says he hasn't looked into Uber's Q1s just yet, but the Q4 numbers didn't write anything he didn't write anything about the Q4 numbers because he too didn't have anything to say he hadn't said before, because it's the same old trick. So he says it's one part of Uber's deliberate effort to make it impossible for investors to understand changes in quarterly results. The improper inclusion of the fluctuating value of the untradeable paper as part of let me go back. I might cut this bit. There wouldn't have been any profit, but for the inclusion of claim changes in the value of untradeable securities, i.e. DD, and all the other names. These were not securities from acquisitions or investments, but were the paper Uber received as payoffs for abandoning hopelessly unprofitable markets, China, Russia, driverless car technology, etc., to large competitors. The improper inclusion of the fluctuating value of this untradeable paper as part of the operating P&L of Uber ongoing marketplace activity goes back to the IPO, when its prospectus wanted to show rapidly diminishing losses. So essentially, it was all an accounting trick. And the Redditors, kudos to them. They figured it out before much of the like investment community and the investment journalist community. It's amazing. So what I found interesting what you said is you've noticed a marked decrease in the quality of service, right?
Yeah, and I think that's true across the board with basically everyone I speak to.
So that was one of Hubert's other theories at the time. He said like the profitability they did manage to squeeze out of the system was entirely related to having to cut back the amount of drivers that they're providing, but also in essentially using algorithmic tools to front run their customers and their drivers. So it looks increasingly like they are deploying airline type tools to do what they call personalized pricing, right? So if you and me stand in the same location and call a cab, we might get two different menus of available prices. So if they know from your past record you're more likely to take the luxury version, they might just not flag that there are cheaper options available to you, whereas you would get the cheaper options. Whereas, sorry, Dario, not to suggest that you don't the luxury cabs, but my one's totally skewed by corporate travel. But the reality is that also applies to the drivers. So the drivers get different, propensity. They have a different propensity to pick up jobs based on what margins they get, and so it looks like they're squeezing the margins of the drivers as well and applying bespoke sort of settings, and that's really sneaky, and I think leads to an overall lower quality of service. Any other thoughts on Hugo? Should we move on?
We can move on.
Then I think we had a brief mention about the debanking of Andy Haldane, the former chief economist of the Bank of England. He told the Telegraph that he believes it was for his political connections to the Bank of England. The quote is, 1, I wasn't working for the Bank of England at that point. 2, the Bank of England is by statute independent from government. 3rd, the Bank of England was their regulator, so the risk was to their regulator. Haldane noted that while the regulations had been imposed with the best of intentions, the KYC regulations he's talking about, they were now having a chilling risk appetite. They were now chilling risk appetite and forestalling investing. He said many new rules introduced by the government and regulators were penny wise but pound foolish. Have you been unbanked yet, Dario?
Thankfully not.
It's a big problem, and again, it's one of the talking points we've been it's one of the themes we've been following here at the Blind Spot, notably the connection to the Financial Action Task Force and how it has essentially hijacked the ministries of justice. It's created a situation where the ministries of finance have hijacked the ministries of justice, and people are being unbanked on a guilty before being proven innocent basis rather than the other way around. It's very bad for civil society, in my opinion. Oh, I forgot to put the banner up. That was rubbish of me. This is...
Yeah. You could argue like with sanctions, the more people they unbank, the more easy it is to live as unbanked, right? Just like how Russia, years on from sanctions, is dragging through.
There will likely be a unintended consequences. I mean, you can't unbank everybody.
I mean, eventually, it just means there's another bank.
Yeah, eventually everyone goes to... Well, I mean, there's now Bitcoin, although Bitcoin isn't what it used to be, but there is the risk that the ostracized turn on you in a big way. And more pertinently, I just think it's really chilling to think that banks have been essentially appointed as police officers, because that's not their area of specialization. Banks are in the business of lending and payments and making loans, credit. They are not in the business of snooping and assessing people's political positions or whether they are criminals or not. That is the job of the police. So the government has kind of created, via pressure from the FATF, a system by which they can cut their police budgets by outsourcing police work to the banks. But banks are not competent in this area, nor are they trained in the kind of legal foundations of what, there are very strict rules on how you can snoop on people. It's a bit of an insider job. It's not, it is quite chilling. But we will be focusing on that in more detail, I'm sure, throughout the rest of the year. Next, civil society influence black box. This is a Politico related story, right? You looked at it. Rolling Stone claimed Politico had missed the mark in its who's who of the pro-Palestine protests against Joe Biden.
So essentially, Politico claimed that the pro-Palestine protests across university campuses in the United States were being directly funded by notable individuals like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Melinda Gates, by the way, just resigned from it. And however, the issue with Politico's reporting was that essentially it found an in-between organization between the Palestine protesters, the donors, and just assumed, or just not necessarily misreported, but just simplified the links between the initial donor and the end client, when actually it went through this middle layer organization that would kind of just get donations from loads and loads of places, millions and millions and millions, and then donated like a couple $100,000 to these Palestine protests, when actually, the fund flows of those donations aren't really clear. I mean, the Bill and Melinda Gates dollars may have ended up in their pockets, but there's no clarity on whether Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, amongst the other donors listed, actually intended that end with their funds.
And that's what I found really interesting about this story. It's that it's the black box of how the donation system works. The whole civil society sector and how it's funded is incredibly mysterious. And if you've never worked in that sector, it's something that you probably have never considered. But it's like a laundromat, and how the money gets repurposed is like a story that still needs to be told. Because it's one thing like donating a lot of money to sort of civil society organizations in Georgia, fighting against the foreign agent, bill. And it's another when you consider that money that is once donated can be recycled anywhere, right? Or there are these third parties that can be apportioning funding on a completely different and subjective level that is removed from the initial objectives of the original financing. It's incredibly fascinating, and it reminds me, of course, of how the offshore network works in general, and the obfuscation that criminals, engage in to mask how they manage their money flows. The fact that this is going on the civil society front, and that you can't really track or trace or understand the origins of where the money flows, kind of speaks against the idea of KYC and AML. I mean, it suggests ultimately it's kind of pointless. Money is fungible, and we should just be, appreciating that it all gets mixed up, and that fundamentally it's hard to control where it goes on. It's similar to like what's going on with sanctions and the oil, right? So oil, technically we're not buying, well, we have a limit on how much oil we can buy from Russia, but sums that go outside of that are being laundered through India via, going to Indian refineries and then coming back into our own markets. But once they're mixed, it's very hard to kind of crack down on it, because it has essentially been laundered. So you've got oil laundering, influence laundering. It's everywhere, right? But that's what I found interesting about that story. Next, DII backlash. Very quickly, it just looks like the DEI backlash is gaining traction. MIT banned the use of DEI statements in the hiring of faculty members and promotions. The university claimed last week. It seems to be a significant turning point, you wrote, in the use of DEI in elite universities. What's your take, very quickly, on this story, Dario? Do you have any opinion?
I mean, it's surprising that they got to this too late, but effectively, realizing that if you're going to hire a top physicist, they don't need to divulge on how they believe they'll improve the university's diversity and equity and inclusion package. That forcing them or encouraging these sorts of quote unquote values won't necessarily make for a better physicist. The only thing I'd say is it's surprising it's taken us this long to get here. Yeah.
I've been very worried about this for a long time because I've seen it before. DEI, there was, original DEI, we saw it in the Soviet Union and in communist Poland, where you had preferential treatment of certain students or certain employees based on how unprivileged and non-elite they were, right? So back then it was all preference based on how I guess the preference was to take in students who didn't benefit from capital ownership and, the working classes and anyone who was a pleb effectively, and it was the elites that were being discriminated. But so the privilege factor was actually economic privilege rather than other forms of privilege. But now, obviously, that has shifted. However, the end result was very similar in that the universities started churning out entirely useless candidates, and the quality of the final certificates you got were kind of a joke, because everyone knew that the only way you could get a certificate was through this absurd system. And then in the end, to get around it, corruption brewed, and so the certificates were handed out based on who had the most money to buy them. So nothing really changed. It was all terrible. Next one. This is a really cool story, I think largely missed by everybody else. Coming moon base. So I didn't even know that they were planning to go to the moon.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people heard about the initial plans to go to the moon, which were announced sort of in line with the deployment of the US Space Force under Donald Trump. I think it was 2017, 2018, with the original aim to get to the moon by 2024 and use it as a hop-off station to Mars. And that's the official goal of Artemis, is to use a moon base, but to use it as a springboard to go to Mars, because effectively on the moon, you can get sufficient hydrogen from frozen water that was discovered ostensibly 5-10 years ago, I think. But really, if you look at research from the 70s and 80s, they were fairly certain that there was going to be water on the moon, and then use that hydrogen to create rocket fuel that you can then go to Mars with. And effectively, it means that you can leave the Earth's atmosphere with more weight than you could otherwise. I've heard about this first in the Paris Air Show with this Venturi Labs that was selling a space rover that could go 20 kilometers per hour, which is insane, to NASA. They lost the contract eventually, but now this all came back into the news with reports that not only had Artemis been delayed again, that the space launch system that's developed by Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and Boeing suffered an issue with their valves, so they weren't able to take off. This was a week and a half ago. And more specifically, and more perhaps worryingly, that Russia and China are planning to build a nuclear station in the moon in order to fulfill their energy goals on the moon. But what this really puts into play is the nature in which the moon race has changed. It's no longer about getting there first, planting a flag and fucking off, and leaving. It's about getting there and staying there. And so the really critical thing is about real estate. It's about location, location, location. There are only certain places in the moon that are good for permanent habitation, which are these really deep craters that the Venturi Space Labs CEO told me could have liquid at the bottom, maybe. But I don't like liquid water, not random liquid.
That's
and so
basically on the moon, even though it's quite large and no one's there, the only possible place you can live is in these craters where they have just enough shadow time because it's not too hot and not too cold.
Basically, I mean, it's terribly cold, but it's not burning hot, and you're kind of protected from asteroids. Maybe the water is going to be easier to access, and so there's only very few of these, and so the race is on. And the Chinese and the Russians are planning to start with moon base building robots, whereas the NASA Artemis program, both of which, by the way, are these international programs. They're not international in anything but name. But the Artemis program is much more ambitious than the Russian and Chinese program. And they're aiming to get humans there to start building the base. They're both aiming for mid-2030s timeline to actually get their base built. But what this kind of reminds me of is, this thing about how NASA spent years and years and years developing the space pen in order so they could write well in space, and the Russians just used a pencil. And of course, it's a bit of a myth because it's true that pencils do shatter a bit in space, and the graphite can damage the electrical components and stuff like that. But nevertheless, there's an approach to simplicity that maybe the Chinese and Russians are going to build a moon base badly, and it's going to be clunky, and the robots aren't really going to know what they're doing, but they're occupying the real estate. Whereas if NASA's focused on getting the most pristine, moon base that Taylor Swift can live in, maybe they'll get there a bit late.
So your critique is that the US has a tendency to over-engineer everything and overthink it and be overly ambitious in its in its targets for such things, whereas they're just being practical.
It's more money for private developers, I guess, more ways of skewing the American taxpayer, whereas the Russians or Chinese want to skew them, but down a longer run, and they need more prestige. So they're going to focus on more concrete objectives. Perhaps that's just speculation.
So now, this was my favorite story from last week. The Pope is going to G7 in June, and it's part of our, I love the, at the Blind Spot, we like to look at things that other people aren't looking at. And I'm very interested in what I'm calling holy wars. And the week before, one of the things I pointed out was that there's been a sort of rush of new Catholic conversions, amongst them Russell Brand and I think Candice Owens, and I think Unheard picked up on this this week. They referenced the fact that there has been this ridiculous spate of conversions, which all implies that maybe the Catholic Church is a little bit more powerful and influential than we had appreciated. But tell our lovely listeners what this angle is.
So this all started because it turns out that the Pope accepted Meloni's invitation to the G7, ostensibly to talk about AI and their new research institute called Ren AI Science Foundation.
And a wonderful little linkage to our theme this week. Yeah. And you you did say the Vatican's marketing people have to get a pay rise for that, right?
Very good. Yeah. Very good. Ren AI Science. But last year, the Pope has said that he's on a secret mission to make peace between Russia and Ukraine. So one can only guess why he's going to actually be going to the G7, again, speculation. But what this ties into is I was Googling about the Pope's peace efforts, and all you get are line after line of either articles condemning the Pope's call for peace or articles that are not critical but supportive of the Pope and trying to understand, hey, why is the Pope changing his mind? Why has he become anti-West? Why is he so pro-Russia now? Why is he calling for peace? And the irony here is that maybe, clearly the Pope hasn't changed. Maybe the West has changed. Because what's the Pope doing? He's calling for peace. Since when has that been an anti-Western position? Maybe that's just because the West has suddenly geared itself towards this, supposedly moral war that's so moral it can't even contemplate the fact that it should end.
Yeah, and I love the point that you make that, it shouldn't really be surprising, as with any media publication, when you want to figure out what their position is, look at who their readers are. And you make the very interesting point, obvious point, really. Look at the Catholics. Who are the Catholics these days? Where are they? They are mostly in what, Latin America, global south. They are not anymore in the NATO G7 world, right? So is it surprising that the Pope is pandering to those opinions? I mean, and let's face it, NATO's not like number one, on the sort of popularity chart in those areas necessarily.
No. And also, I think this impression may have been created by the fact that the Vatican Church was always so pro NATO during the Cold War, but that's because they were facing off with, like, literally, the Catholics' idea of the Antichrist in the USSR. So I think that may have changed. That may have skewered our perceptions of how the Vatican plays.
I thought that was a very good point you made, because obviously the enemy is they're a little bit more diplomatic than that, but you can totally understand why, in terms of who annoys the Catholic Church most, it's obviously going to be the atheists or people spreading atheism on a massive level. I mean, it's even the case, arguably, that they're going to respect other religious leaders more so than atheistic institutions, right? So
Yep.
Fight in 1980s Solidarność. I mean, again, weirdly, we're all aligned. The biggest influence up, the proto-color revolution, really, Solidarity, was, a fight to get rid of the sort of communist yoke in Poland, right? And that was explicitly supported and secretly, funded by the Vatican for reasons, not just the fact that Pope John Paul II was Polish, but you're right. I think that has kind of skewed the perception of the Vatican as always going to be aligned with NATO, but historically that was not necessarily the case, right?
Mm-hmm. Not at all.
Historically, the call for the push for peace is essentially where the Vatican has stood on many issues. So very interesting point. Of course, today I believe the Vatican has maybe do a quick Google check. Today is the day the Vatican is also releasing.
Yeah, it is.
It's let's have a look. I believe.
Yeah, it's already been updated now. Vatican updates norms to authenticate visions of Mary, weeping statues, and stigmata.
Yes. So they are essentially trying to give new guidelines on how the Catholics should treat all sort of mysterious supernatural events. And the UAP community has picked up on this in a big way. They think it's quite meaningful. We haven't gone through it yet, but perhaps we will, and we will update in this week's newsletter. Which leaves us, well, before we get to what's coming up, the big blind spot, obviously, was that everything is an influence op. I encourage you to read my analysis, but I'll just quickly state that it was inspired by a belated realization that civil society organizations, which I was, have had very little connection with other than, say, when I was living and working in Azerbaijan. And at the time I found, like most people in the NGO sector, somewhat, sorry to say, quite nauseating. I found the whole thing quite, I didn't like the vibe of the whole thing. It felt like there were very many pompous and supercilious people who weren't necessarily, I mean, I'm sure this is a terrible generalization. I'm sure there are legitimate, caring individuals who really want to help. But it seemed like a lot of money was being wasted on the ground to me, and very little of it was ending up with the people that it was supposedly being directed at. And it seemed very obvious to me that most of these NGOs had political agendas. So I was kind of, not disgusted is maybe too strong a word, but I was certainly put off by the whole system. It wasn't something that I ever wanted to work in. And my argument in the big blind spot is that people like me, who tend to, like, people in finance, people who've never really focused on politics because we've been more focused on the sector of the economy that is actually doing and making and adding value, have to our detriment overlooked this sector. And actually, when you dive back in and you see how they operate, you realize funnily enough, that all that kind of wokest language, all the kind of all the management practices that have given us DEI and have given us these very inclusive, feedback obsessed protocols, which ensure that instead of a project taking 2 weeks to implement, it ends up taking 3 months. They all stem from the language of civil society organizations and this obsessive need to like create inclusive language to get to be able to push their agendas in a way that disguises the fact that they have agendas, right? So you have all these meetings, these endless sort of like consultations and opportunity. That's why I called it the tyranny of the sticky note, because there's 1,000 whiteboards and everyone has to have their say. And then in the end, the facilitator decides everything anyway. So it's all very theatrical, and it's all meaningless. And I think it's one of the issues that is really pulling down productivity and leading to this insane rise in bureaucracy. So in a nutshell, the argument is that civil society practices have infiltrated and infected normal corporate practices, which are much more hierarchical. They used to be much more hierarchical and linear, and top down. And so now we have this continuing political struggle within most organizations. Everything has become an influence op, and every corporate mission is now expanded beyond the pure profit motivation. It has to have this added social justice element to it, which detracts from the ability to actually measure whether it's effective, because it's very easy to measure if a company is profitable. It's not so easy to measure if it's socially impactful, right? It's very subjective. And Uber is actually a good example of that. I say in the piece that I think Uber was really, it is the poster child of these these two sort of ways of managing organizations coming, fusing together, because Uber is as much an activist organization as it is a corporation. And of course, the fact that it is loss leading and has never properly made a profit ties in with that. So that was the big blind spot. So do read it. That's a quick summary. And we will leave, I think, this, I guess, experimental wrap-up show with a quick hint of what we're working on for next week's newsletter. So Dario, why don't you run through your list of...
So I'm obviously going to be looking at GameStop and Roaring Kitty, and the fact that I'm obsessed with Dune and how it has a lot of similarities between the Legend of the Kwisatz Haderach and the mother of all short squeezes, or the Moas.
I really can't wait for you to explain all that. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah. And the second one,
before you go to your second point, can you explain to me why Roaring Kitty only talks in like video clip memes?
So I don't want to say that it's got to his head, because he used to be a lot more upfront about everything, but he's been quiet for 3 years and he's been planning this for a very long time. So I'd say it's his idea of hype building, but we don't know yet. We don't really know until he shows his face and starts talking, because maybe it's completely, he's gone cuckoo, or maybe he's really onto something. So
okay,
we don't know.
Next, what's coming up?
The next one that's coming up is the almost assassination of Fico, the Slovakian prime minister, and a little distillation on what the hell did the would-be assassin want. Was he pro-Russian? Was he pro-Ukrainian? Everything seems to be a mess, and I'm going to try to get to the bottom of that.
And number 3?
Honorable mentions that we're going to keep an eye on, right?
Yeah.
The first is Russian turtle tanks.
I have no idea.
The battlefield is slowly turning into World War I, where the tanks now, instead of looking, tanky like that with a turret, they just put a box on top of the tank, just a box of sheet metal, just so that drones can't hit them. So now all the tanks look like World War I tanks. It's hilarious. It's crazy. And the next honorable mention is New Caledonia. Why is France sending in dozens and dozens of troops? Why have 4 policemen already been murdered? Why has the French authorities vouched for the creation of self-defense militias that are armed? which would never happen in mainland France. And how come? Well, like 4 armories have been raided and all the weapons stolen and distributed among the protesters. So, and there seems to be Azerbaijani flags in the mix. France is accusing Azerbaijan of meddling. China's in the mix as well. And it all has to do with nickel. There you go.
Well, that sounds super interesting. I'm looking at I have to look at von der Leyen's announcement of her new democracy shield, which I think is hilarious in terms of the branding of the idea. Because obviously we say democracy shield. They say the enemy say stuff like great firewall, great firewall of China. I mean, is there a difference? Is there really different? Is there anything really markedly different between the two? I don't know. It seems to me a perfect example of it's okay when we do it. I am also going to pivot around. I'm going to orbit around the Roaring Kitty story, but take a different angle at it, looking at the shorting side of it and how it feeds into the greater story of Overstock and Patrick Byrne and fails to deliver, and what is coming up in May, which is at the end of May, which is when the entire US stock market is supposed to go from T+2 settlement to T+1 settlement, and whether this is actually meaningful and will have any impact. And last and not least, over at my other job, Politico, we just published a big interview with Liz Truss, our former PM. And I'll just give a little summary of that, because there were a few aspects of, well, not all of it made it into the podcast. So I have a few little insights that I found quite interesting. Mainly the theme is that she thought there was an expectation for the BOE to recalibrate its monetary policy around the fact that she had a very expansive and loose fiscal policy, rather than to try and sabotage it. So the whole interview is really about who should be bending to whose policy, and she felt it should be the BOE bending to the fiscal policy, not the other way around. And I think to some degree she has a good point. That's coming up from my end, but we will probably sprinkle in some other things as they happen throughout the day. And I hope this was useful. If not, give us feedback. I mean, this was really experimental, so it's helped us figure out our plan for the day.
Yep.
Thank you very much.